The Philippines has opened relations with China, including economic relations, and this has gotten the US bitter and angry. Let's get into it. This Asian country is strategically critical to both China and the US. Who will it choose? The Philippines has a vital trade relationship with Beijing, but Washington sees it as a staging ground for potential Taiwan hostilities, meaning the US wants to use the Philippines as a pawn to get at China. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the president of the Philippines, opened 2023 by making a visit to China. There, 14 bilateral agreements were signed between Manila and Beijing. Between the two, this sort of diplomacy is not unusual. They are close economic partners, with China being the Philippines' largest export market and a critical source of inbound investment, especially as part of the Belt of Road Initiative (BRI). The two countries have disputes, of course, especially when it comes to the South China Sea, but they have elected not to allow that to spoil the bigger picture of bilateral relations, at least for now. But there is one elephant in the room, which haunts Manila's ties with Beijing, and that is the interloping American military. And that is a country that perceives itself as a true and rightful master of the Philippines, the United States. This article is really good so far. The United States wants to dominate every country on Earth, and every region on every country on Earth and every region on Earth, from the Middle East to Africa to Latin America, and in this article it specifies in Asia as well. Even as Marcos Jr. develops, this is U.S. imperialism at work. Even as Marcos Jr. develops his cooperation with China, the newly elected president is facing considerable pressure from Washington to allow it to increase its military presence in the country and potentially get roped into a potential Taiwan contingency owing to the Philippines' critical geostrategic position. So the U.S. is using Philippines as a base. It wants to use it as a base and a ground to potentially attack China. So in this case, the U.S. is using the Philippines as a pawn. This has led the foreign policy of the archipelago country to become a tightrope balancing act, which could easily plunge it into disaster if something goes wrong. That's another good point. If something goes wrong, meaning if one country, China or the U.S., launch a missile or get close to each other, in terms of Navy or Air Force, that's forcing the Philippines to get involved. The Philippines is a staple of American power in the Asia Pacific. That's because it bears the dubious distinction of being the only country in Asia to have been a literal colony of the U.S. Once a dominion of Imperial Spain, the islands were annexed by Washington following the Spanish-American War of 1898. The war was what allowed the U.S. to become a great power in the Pacific, and the Philippines would remain in its possession until after the Second World War, with the U.S. having fought off a Japanese invasion of the islands. Having become president, the Philippines naturally became a U.S. ally. As a series of islands located off Southeast Asia, the country allows the U.S. to project military power onto the continent. For example, by using its naval bases during the Vietnam War. Absolutely terrible. The Philippines is a staging ground for the U.S. to play with its toys. It's the same thing with the Middle East. It's the same thing in Eastern Europe. It's the same thing elsewhere around the world with the U.S. and its imperialism. Situated just to the north of the islands is Taiwan and mainland China. Given it this strategic value, the U.S. sees the Philippines as a critical piece on the board, like I said, a pawn, for any future conflict against Beijing. The islands are essential to stopping China from realizing its claims over the entirety of the South China Sea and fighting back against the Taiwan contingency. The U.S. could not have made that clearer in its recent overtures to Manila. But it isn't that simple. Although the Philippines has grievances with Beijing over contested territory in the South China Sea and has been instinctively pro-US for its recent history, the reality is that it's a poor country, and alignment with the US doesn't alleviate that, doesn't alleviate the Philippines' poverty. The Philippines needs an export market, it needs infrastructure investment, and it needs Chinese tourism. China's not just a neighbor, but the best positioned country in the world to provide all of these things. This has made the bilateral relationship stable despite moments of tension over the South China Sea. As a result, the Philippines does not behave in its foreign policy like an overt ally of the US in the way a country like Japan would, but rather seeks to carefully hedge itself between Washington and Beijing. This realignment of the Philippines' foreign policy began with the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte in 2016, who sought to assert the country's geopolitical autonomy by more actively courting China while keeping Washington at arm's length. A really good, wise foreign policy on his part. This was because Duterte's understanding of what constitutes national interests. His approach to issues such as crime as well as the economy did not align with America's vision. Although Duterte did not throw out the U.S. completely, as evidenced by his decision not to terminate the Visiting Forces Agreement, he positioned the country so it might not become a U.S. proxy against Beijing. Very wise president that they had with Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte, in that policy aspect, and understood China was useful in some aspects as a partner. It is perceived that newly elected President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. may be more pro-U.S. than Duterte, especially given the legacy of his father. However, his decision to start the year by making an official visit to China, seeking what he called a shift to a quote-unquote higher gear in bilateral relations, is indicative of the fact that this trend of hedging between Washington and Beijing in foreign policy will continue. When visiting, it is clear he will seek to reinforce the aspect of economic ties between the two countries, but also reassure China that the Philippines will not become a mere military platform for the U.S., which is what the United States absolutely wants from the Philippines. It wants its strategic geopolitical bases, military bases on there for geopolitical and geostrategic reasons. However, how this ultimately pans out remains to be seen. It is anticipated that in 2023, the U.S. will attempt to ramp up Taiwan tensions further. This year, that means. The goal of doing so will, of course, be to break any unity and harmonious ties between China and Asian countries with the goal of projecting its military power further, as it has done with Ukraine. How will Manila navigate these crises? How will it handle U.S. requests for more and more military access, which the U.S. is continuing to pressure the Philippines? Absolutely unethical and, violent in nature. And how will China manage this situation? While the visit is promising on the diplomatic front, it tells us little about what is to come ultimately. So my final thoughts on this are the Philippines is being pressured more and more by the United States to provide more and more military access due to its geopolitical strategic location, because it wants to continue to provoke China, and it wants to use Asian countries as pawns, as replaceable pieces in order to contain China, in order to hinder China's growth. We all know China's economic prosperity has surpassed, many expectations and is likely to surpass the United States in terms of GDP. And so that's not what the United States wants. The United States wants a weakened China. It wants complete hegemony all over the globe and in various regions, from the Middle East to Africa, to Latin America, to Asia, Eastern Europe, and so on. And so I support the Philippines and their peace policy of trying to develop economic ties and various ties, social, economic, political, diplomatic, with their neighbors. The United States needs to butt out of all of these countries' business. It's the same with the Middle East. The United States needs to butt out of the Middle East business. It is because of the United States that we have apartheid and fascist states like Israel doing whatever it wants, carte blanche, blank check. And so this is a good thing. The Philippines is headed in the right direction. The article mentioned how the Philippines is impoverished, and so they're doing what they can to stick close to China and their economic prosperity. The Filipinos have to look out for themselves. Unfortunately, they've put U.S. foreign policy slash military policy ahead of their own interests. And so Rodrigo Duterte and Marcos Jr., these guys are shifting their foreign policy. They're, courting China. They want peace with their neighbors. Even the South China Sea, which the United States and its propaganda media continue to bring up in order to divide both the Philippines and China, and in order to create a wedge between the two countries. That issue is being, discussed, and there are various things that both China and the Philippines can do and are doing to sort of address that issue. They mentioned, having coast guards of both countries coordinate between each other. They mentioned China allowing, the Philippine fishermen to, fish and provide for themselves in the South China Sea and so on. And so despite all of this, they're making it work. China and the Philippines are making it work. And what we're going to see in the future is the U.S. continuing to prod, continuing to force the Philippines into playing more of a role in its hostility with China. And so the Philippines needs to do what it can to not only maintain a balancing act. Unfortunately, that includes maintaining a relationship with the United States, but it also means looking out for the interests of its people. And so developing strong economic ties, which is what they're currently doing, and standing firm in this policy that Marcos and Rodrigo Duterte have adopted of, a peace policy with everybody, commerce with all, ally with none. And so this is a good thing, what we're seeing. And I wish that other regions around the world were doing the same thing. I wish the Middle East was doing the same thing. I wish Africa was doing the same thing. I wish Latin America, Eastern Europe were doing the same thing and allying with each other and pushing the United States, the interlopers, out of their business. So if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, let me know what you guys think about this story and this foreign policy event. If you're on listening to this on the podcast, then tweet me. Let me know what you think. Do you disagree? Do you disagree that this is a bad policy for the Philippines? Do you want the Philippines to adopt a different policy? Let me know what you guys think. Take care.